It is often said that money is the root of all evil, and as anyone with even a passing interest in true crime can attest to, it is all too often this simple object that motivates someone to commit the most unspeakable of acts, even against someone who believes them to be a friend. Sarah Stern was a 19-year-old from Belmar, New Jersey. Growing up, she was an avid artist and would frequently take part in school plays. She also considered herself something of a nerd, and enjoyed going to events like Comic-Con and even doing cosplays on occasion. Her dream was to work in either film or television production, and it was something she had worked diligently to pursue. Sarah's parents, Michael and Carla Stern, were supportive of their daughter's dream, and did their best to provide a home life where her creative instincts would flourish. It wasn't all easy, though. Tragically, Carla would die from cancer in 2013, leaving Sarah and her father absolutely devastated. There would have been no way for her to know this at the time, but the passing of her mother ultimately started these series of events which would cost Sarah her own life just a few years later. In 2016, Sarah was attending Brookdale Community College where she was studying TV production. As you can imagine, given her interest in the subject, many of Sarah's friends were also aspiring artists. Among her closest friends were Liam McAtasney and Preston Taylor. The three had met in middle school and remained extremely close during and after high school. In fact, Taylor was Sarah's junior prom date, and the two attended their prom with a large group that included McAtasney. Both Liam and Preston were described as jokers by their classmates, two guys who liked to just hang out, joke around, smoke some weed on occasion, and have a good time. The truth, in fact, was much darker. These fun, easygoing demeanors were a cover for something much more sinister underneath. In the summer of 2016, Sarah came into possession of a shoebox full of money that once belonged to her mother. I wasn't able to find the story behind this money, so I'm not sure if this was something her father didn't know about or if it was kind of a surprise thing he and Carla had thought of, but for the purposes of this case, it honestly isn't too relevant. What we do know is the money did exist, and it was in the neighborhood of about $100,000. So pretty life-altering money for someone of any age, much less a 19-year-old. According to Sarah's father, she was planning on using the money to move to Toronto, Canada, after falling in love with the city on a recent vacation. Tragically, she would never get that opportunity. On December 3, 2016, Sarah Stern mysteriously disappeared from her home. She was last seen by a neighbor driving her grandmother's 1991 Oldsmobile. As with all missing person cases, police originally held out hope that Sarah was just having a fight with her family or some other reason as to explain where she'd gone. That hope, however, was soon dashed. The Oldsmobile was found on the Belmar Bridge, which sits just over the Shark River. This bridge is notable because it is one of the last land bridges on the Jersey Shore before the Atlantic Ocean. As a result, it has often been utilized by people looking to take their own life. A massive search effort was quickly organized involving police divers and dozens of volunteers from Sarah's circle of friends and colleagues. Among them were her close friends Liam McAtasney and Preston Taylor. Days, then eventually weeks went by, and the search was eventually called off with nothing to show for it. Sarah's family continued to hold out hope that she'd be found safe and worked hard to spread word of her story over social media. Behind the scenes, though, police weren't so optimistic. If she had indeed jumped into the Shark River, the odds of her being recovered were unfortunately slim. And unless she was pulling some elaborate scheme to fake her own death, the odds of her being anywhere else seemed equally slim. Despite the hard work of police and Sarah's loved ones, it seemed as though this case was destined to become cold. Anthony Curry is a 21-year-old independent filmmaker living in New Jersey, and he is also one of the best friends of Liam McAtasney. The two had become close friends during their high school years, bonding over their shared interest in various films, TV shows, and music. Curry described the two as so close that he basically lived over Liam's house several days a week. He hadn't known Sarah Stern all that well, but he was aware of her disappearance. and it made him think about some conversations he had previously had with his good friend Liam. On Thanksgiving Day, just a few weeks before Sarah went missing, the two were hanging out when Liam suddenly started pitching a film idea to Anthony. This wasn't unusual, according to Curry. Liam did this sort of thing all the time. But the subject of the film was strange. It was a horror movie about a woman who is robbed, strangled to death, and then thrown off a bridge. Even after he found out about Stern's disappearance and the circumstances around it, Curry still tried to give his friend the benefit of the doubt. However, that quickly ended when Liam started contacting Anthony on Snapchat and asking him questions like, "Are the police looking for me?" and "Have you talked to the police about me?" Anthony immediately realized that what his friend described to him that Thanksgiving night wasn't a movie at all. Anthony went back and forth for a while. Again, he and Liam were very close, and he didn't want to imagine his best friend could hurt somebody. But he couldn't keep denying reality to himself. Liam wasn't asking the questions he was asking for no reason, after all. If he hadn't been personally responsible for Sarah's disappearance, there was at least a good chance he knew who was, and Curry felt a moral obligation to come forward. So in January of 2017, that's exactly what he did. When Anthony contacted police, he had no way of knowing it, but he was going to provide them with the lead to break the case wide open. Liam McAtasney was a name they were already familiar with, as he was interviewed during police's initial search for Sarah. Unfortunately, due to the fact her remains hadn't been found, putting together a case for murder was going to be difficult. Curry had taken screenshots of a few Snapchat messages he and Liam had exchanged, but there wasn't anything concrete in those. Just asking if the police were looking for him wasn't enough. Investigators needed something more. They asked Curry if he would be comfortable going to see Liam in his car, where police would install a surveillance camera and microphone. Anthony agreed, contacted Liam, and asked him to meet. Bradley Beach had been Anthony Curry and Liam McAtasney's favorite hangout spot for several years. The two would spend long hours there smoking weed and hanging out with their friends. The meeting they were having in January of 2017, though, was very different. Anthony later recalled that Liam seemed like an entirely new person when he got into his car that night. He was tense, nervous, and extremely paranoid, immediately patting down Anthony to check him for a wire, but the entire time neglecting to realize the camera police had placed in the vehicle. What follows is an extremely chilling conversation. Liam explains to Anthony how he and Sarah spent the 3rd of December as they had often done, hanging out together, then going out to get food. When they returned to Sarah's home, though, things took a dark turn. Once inside, Liam snuck up behind his friend and began to strangle her, intent on killing her and robbing her for her money. It was a plan Liam had begun brainstorming the second Sarah had told him about the shoebox. McAtasney proceeds to tell Curry in disturbing detail how he spent a half hour strangling Sarah before she finally died, and how even up to her final moments, she was pleading with him to spare her life. He also expressed disappointment at the amount of money he ended up finding, only about $7,000, much less than the 6-figure payday he was expecting. Liam was not alone in the planning of this. He had discussed robbing Sarah several times with none other than Preston Taylor, the man who'd taken Sarah to her junior prom. Taylor didn't accompany Liam to Stern's house, nor did he take part in the actual murder. But now that the deed was done, McAtasney realized he needed to get rid of Sarah's body, and fast. That evening, the two went over to her home and retrieved her body, placing her in the front seat of her car to make it look like she was sleeping. Then proceeded to drive to the Belmar Bridge, where they threw her body into the water below and left the car running to make it appear like a suicide. Anthony could hardly believe what he was hearing, and New Jersey police were equally shocked. Realizing Liam had likely been the brains behind the operation, investigators decided to bring Preston in for questioning first, hoping that maybe they could get some information out of him. He confessed immediately to police, and almost the same breath agreed to turn state's witness against Liam. Preston explained to police that the original plan from a few months ago was simply to rob Sarah, but according to him, Liam seemed to have this obsession with the idea of strangling her to death. He talked about it so much that it seemed to be almost some sort of ritualistic fantasy for him. According to Taylor, he never fully committed to the plan, as he wasn't necessarily excited about the idea of committing murder in the same way Liam was. However, when McAtasney called him and told him that he'd already killed Sarah and simply needed help to dispose of her body in exchange for a cut of the money, Taylor agreed to help. An arrest warrant was issued for Liam McAtasney, and he was charged with first-degree murder. When Liam was arrested, he denied everything. Even when he was made aware of the secret recording, he pled not guilty. The defense he and his lawyers came up with to explain the video was creative, if nothing else. When trial began in January of 2019, they argued that Liam was under the impression he was auditioning for a role in one of Curry's films. And what looked like a confession to a cold-blooded murder was in fact Liam simply playing a role and reciting lines from a script he'd memorized. Which is just breathtaking if I'm being honest, and makes me wonder how much time Liam's lawyers spent trying to talk him into taking a plea deal before settling on this as their best defense. Of course, the trial wasn't exactly a layup for the prosecution either. As we've discussed on this channel before, trying to secure a murder conviction without a body is extremely difficult unless you have very substantial evidence. Fortunately for prosecutors, not only did they have Liam giving a play-by-play recap of the murder on camera, but they also had Preston Taylor essentially confirming everything said on the recording had happened. With all this evidence, prosecutors were able to put together a very convincing case, despite the creative defense that McAtasney and his lawyers came up with. Liam was found guilty in February of 2019 for the murder of Sarah Stern. A few months later in June, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He would appeal this sentence, but in 2022, his conviction was upheld. His team then filed a motion for a new trial, which was also denied in 2023. Barring some sort of shocking event, he will spend the remainder of his life in prison. As far as Preston Taylor goes, he had fully cooperated with police, who in exchange dropped all of the murder-related charges and instead only charged him with multiple counts of robbery and evidence tampering. Taylor was hoping for at most a 5 to 10 year sentence when he entered his guilty plea. The judge, however, felt a little differently and instead handed Preston an 18-year sentence with a 15-year minimum before he could apply for parole. Preston would appeal this sentence, but those appeals were shot down, and it appears he will be spending the better part of the next 2 decades behind bars. For the friends and loved ones of Sarah Stern, her tragic death will never be far from their minds and hearts. Her father, now living with the pain of losing both his wife and daughter, has described the incessant anger he feels on an almost daily basis. Sarah's body has never been recovered, and probably never will be, but those close to her have worked hard to keep her memory alive. Anthony Curry has been hailed by many as a hero for his willingness to come forward, with prosecutors going so far as to say the murder likely wouldn't have been solved were it not for the young filmmaker. Anthony, for his part, remains humble and simply says he was just doing the right thing. It is ironic and somewhat poetic that after being betrayed by her 2 best friends in the most heinous way possible, the person who likely delivered justice for Sarah Stern was a man she barely knew.